talked about in terms of the 19th century and the rise of an industrial economy. Everybody okay with that?
Yes.
Okay. If you remember our lecture last week, we said that over a fairly long period of time, that there is a kind of transition from a self-contained community where essentially everyone's needs in theory are met within that community to an increasingly diverse environment, which brings with it a new kind of dependence. You no longer grow your own food, you buy your food. Do you remember what we said last week, Megan, about that and the impact that had on society?
Yes.
Good. You want to explain that briefly or make a comment or two about that?
So in the self-contained society, you know, everyone works together, and well, I guess the point I'm trying to get at is when it goes into the mercantile society, people can start buying things that they themselves did not create. And that's what spurs the economy.
Exactly. And in Marxist terms, this is the beginning of something called surplus capital. So if we look at this from a different perspective, then in the feudal world, there is a tight-knit link between production and consumption, such that there's no surplus value. Am I making sense? Whitley, does that make sense?
Yeah. Do you know who Ted Kaczynski is? Ted Kaczynski. I don't know if I'm saying that name right, but he was like the bomb guy, and he wrote that manifesto. This is like everything that was in that manifesto that we are talking about.
Yep, the Unabomber. Excellent point. That's right. So in the world, in the feudal world, not only is there no surplus value, but consumption and production are both tied to the land. If you go back to what we said in terms of Charles Darwin, this is tightly knit sociologically to the family, the tribe, and the village. We said that one of the things that characterized the transition, if we put the mercantile people, is that when you begin to get a growing mercantile class, you also begin a migration into a more urban environment. you also begin to get the creation of surplus value, because those people who are in a position of wealth, as we noted, they make nothing. When we move to a capitalist society, alienation occurs on multiple fronts. We're alienated from our family, from our tribe, and we don't live in a village. Okay, is this clear so far?
Yes.
Okay, are there any questions so far? Okay,
No.
so let's look at feudal society. It is largely two classes. You have the lord of the manor, and you have everyone else. In some senses, rather than be oppressive, this is a symbiotic relationship. The lord of the manor protects everybody with his life if necessary. And while he does not farm, he does live on the produce that the people he protects, the people who live on his manor, give to him. Now, while Marx would say that that's still oppressive, more about that later, it becomes intensely more complex and more oppressive when we get to capitalism. Why? Well, number one, there is every incentive to keep wages low. Why? Because the lower the wages, the greater the surplus value. Two, the wealthy make nothing. Their wealth is derived from oppression. Marx will say, at least in a feudal society, whereas in capitalism, workers own nothing. If we think about the word job as an anachronism, job means just over broke. So for Marx, to be human is to produce. If you want to say it is to create with your hands, and to reap the value you create. In capitalism, neither of these is true. So Marx will say the worker and the factory owner are both alienated and oppressed. The worker is oppressed because the fruit of his labor is taken. The factory owner because he makes nothing. And if you define being human as creating with your hands, as producing, then the wealthier the factory owner becomes, the more inhuman he becomes. All right, let me stop there. Questions, thoughts, comments? What's your reaction?
I mean, it does make sense that you're more alienated the further away from a process you are.
Mm-hmm.
I know personally in my job, whenever I work a task from start to finish, it's far more enjoyable than just working one little part and not seeing the finished product.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to reap what you have sown gives far more purpose in life. So that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And do you see how the factory owner is incented to oppress you more?
Yes, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So rather than real value, wealth is artificial for multiple reasons. Value for Marx has to be translated into product or production. Wealth is accumulated, let's say, potential value. To that end, it has no point, no purpose, or no function in society. In fact, Marxist economists will argue that the greater the concentration of wealth in the hands of the few, inherently more unstable a society becomes. If you think about this in terms of contemporary America, about 10%, directly or indirectly controls 90% of the wealth of our country. We said last week that from 1970 to 2020, over a span of 50 years, inflation has been 400%. The middle class and the lower class have seen their income rise 12 to 13%. The top 10% have seen their income exceed, or at a bare minimum equal, the 400% inflation. So, for Marx, this is a further indication of the depth of the problem. And if you add to this the roughly 8% inflation we've suffered this year, it furthers, again, in Marxist terms, the oppression of the working class. Questions, comments, thoughts so far? Okay. Let's look more closely at the intellectual foundation to Marx and Marxism, and then we'll try to apply it through the 19th century and to where we are now. So to begin with, Marx's family was raised Jewish, but in 19th century Germany, there was a move to force Jews to convert to Christianity. So Marx's family, who were civil servants, either converted or lost their jobs. One of Marx's most important points what do you think he means by that? Religion is the opiate of the people. Alexis, you want to give it a try? Megan, you want to give it a try?
So first, to do that, we need to define the word opiate.
Okay, great point. What do you think an opiate is?
Is it like the pinnacle?
Well, opiate is a reference to heroin.
Oh, like opium.
Yep.
Okay.
And opioid, as in the current opioid crisis we have.
So he's
What do
saying,
you think he means by religion is the opiate of the people?
so he's basically saying religion is the drug of the people.
Yep.
It makes you feel better.
Not only does it make you feel better, what else does it do?
It takes your mind off of what is actually happening.
That's right. And how does it take your mind off your oppression?
It gives you like a higher power to believe in.
That's right. And with that belief in a higher power, comes belief in the immortality of the soul.
Mm-hmm.
So if I want to oppress you, I draw a link between the immortality of the soul do what I tell you to do. We talked about this guy a couple of weeks ago. Do you remember our conversation about Holyoke? Okay. He grew up poor. And you may remember there were some turning points in his life. The first is that when he was 7 years old, he's working on a machine called a lathe, making buttons for his mother's cottage industry. His scarf gets caught in the lathe and he's nearly choked to death. No, I think everybody can see my screen. Can you all see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Maybe you cannot. You might want to try logging off and logging back in. Okay, so his near-death experience, he screams and someone hears him and his life is saved. His second experience, the Church of England at the time the clergy were all from wealthy families. So whose side did they take? Holyoke's younger, yeah, Holyoke's younger sister had TB. And the Church of England had so much power that if you didn't pay your church tax, they would charge you interest. And if you still didn't pay your church tax, they would take everything you own. Everything. Holyoke's mother was late paying the church tax. She went to the church to pay the tax. She was gone longer than expected, and by the time she got back, his sister was dead. The third was that if you were poor, you had no education. The Unitarian Church, a kind of non-Christian church, literally had Sunday school. Where people went to learn to read. And Holyoke was 17 years old by the time he learned to read. It was because of experiences like this that Karl Marx argued that religion was the opiate of the people. No matter how much you suffer now, God is good and there will be life in heaven. Hence, religion is the opiate of the people. All right, any questions about that?
No.
Okay. All right, so Marx was a member of a group of men in Germany and Austria at the time called the Young Hegelians. They were disciples of a late 18th, early 19th century philosopher named Hegel. If we go back to a point that we made earlier, we said that in terms of most of the history of the West, there are four men who dominate the 19th century: Auguste Comte, Jeremy Bentham, Thomas Malthus, and Lamarck. In Germany, at precisely the same time, we have an interesting turn, a kind of counter theme involving Hegel, Fichte, Schelling, and Hölderlin. This interplay, sometimes called German Romanticism, which became a kind of German idealism, stresses a number of similar themes. Comte, for example, you'll recall, said that there are three stages in the development of human religion, and that the ultimate end is positivism, the religion of humans. There is no God, only human nature. Hegel is going to argue that all of history is a process. And if we go back to the earliest experience of human being in the family, to the 19th century, what we will see is that this is a process of increasing freedom. So in the family, because of the need to survive, no one is free. In a monarchy, some are free. Actually, one is free. In a mercantile society, some are free. And for Hegel, the end of human history is the freedom of all humans. Hegel also argued that history has laws. We may not understand them, we may not perceive them, but they're there. He also argued that history can be understood as a process of moving from abstract freedom to a concrete notion of freedom, and therefore moving from possibility to actuality. Which ultimately is the freedom of all humans. Driving history, for lack of a better phrase, is Geist. Geist is German for spirit. It is not clear what Hegel was talking about. Potentially this is God? Others have argued, no, it's reason itself. In the end, we really don't know. But this concept of history as process, this concept of history as ending in the freedom of all people, becomes the driving force behind Marxism. All right, questions, comments, thoughts so far? Am I being clear? I know this is a lot to get.
Yeah, I'm probably gonna have to go back and like watch this video over to write all this down. It's like
I understand.
my notes look rough right now.
I understand. It's a lot to get, and it is 8:30 at night. Nicole, what do you think? Nicole, are you there? Okay.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm actually at work, so I'm gonna like step away a little bit before I can talk. But
Okay.
yeah, like everybody said, I think I have to go back and like work the video again once we upload it to get like everything. Like I say, I'm at work and I'm still focused, but not all the way. So I might have to go back and see the video to like get
Okay.
everything that was said today.
Good. Well, again, hopefully by noontime tomorrow, this video will be up. So if, yeah, go ahead.
Hear me?
I'm sorry.
Okay. You guys can hear me.
I can, but you're a bit garbled. Try it one more
Can you
time.
guys hear me? I don't know if I.
Okay. All right. So if we think about what Marx wants to argue, he's going to argue that the end of human history is a
Okay, is it clear now?
classless. Yes.
Oh, okay. I was asking if you guys can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you. Okay. So for Marx, the end of human history is a classless society. And Marx points to a number of phenomena that will go away. For example, for Marx, the concept of private property is an indication of alienation. So at the end of history, there'll be no private property. Instead, we will have communal ownership. The collective. And Marx truly believed that in a communist society, someone who tilled the fields during the day could go home at night and create great art. That the problems that we face as a society are the consequence of alienation. How we get to a classless society becomes part of the issue. So for Marx, the proletariat the working class must unite and overthrow the chains of oppression. Now, whether Marx meant unite in a violent sense or not is another matter. But clearly, class conflict is a function of alienation. And only when alienation is ended will there be true equality in society. No more private property, no more accumulation of wealth. Everyone's needs get met. I did, yes. I see that you are having technical problems and I'm not sure why. But yes, if you want, you can always enter something else in the chat window. Okay. How this happens becomes a matter of debate. Marx will eventually do a lot of work, and you're going to be reading some of it this week, on political economy. Which was intended to lay the foundation for a Marxist or communist economic theory. Again, I'm not a Marxist, but I think that Marx's critique of capitalism is spot on. I'm not sure that his solution works. In fact, I'm pretty sure it doesn't, and we'll be looking at that momentarily. I also want to make the point that a driving force behind Marx's ideology is a 19th century philosopher by the name of Ludwig Feuerbach. And Feuerbach said, in essence, that God is the name we give to all that we wish we were. But are not. So Marx's concept that religion is the opiate of the people comes from Feuerbach. It also comes in part from Auguste Comte. Remember, Comte's third stage is positivism. In positivism, humans become their own God. All right, in the time that we have left, and we may go a minute or two over, let's talk about some additional theory pertaining to Marxism. Let's talk about what happened in Marxism or to Marxism and try to bring it all together in some cohesive statement at the end. When you read Marx, it is very clear that he expected that there would be a revolution in the 19th century in 4 countries: the United States, Great Britain, France, and Germany, in that order. It clearly did not happen. What happened, particularly in these 3, less in the United States, is the rise of socialism. Socialism is an attempt to find a middle ground between capitalism and communism. As to why a communist revolution did not occur in the US, Britain, France, and Germany, in the United States, particularly in the early 20th century, had it not been for social welfare programs, there would have been a communist revolution in the United States. And if the ongoing difference between the wealthy and the poor is not brought to an end, I would not underestimate the possibility for a civil war, if not a communist revolution. Marx was right. The greater the separation between the wealthy and the worker, the more unstable a society becomes. The greater the separation between the wealthy and the worker, the greater the chance of a revolution. If you go back to what I said, it's hard for me to imagine that this can continue. What Marx did not understand, there was no way he could have, was the impact of technology in the 20th century. I've mentioned this to you before. MIT, in research done in 2017, said that in 2011, for the first time, the gross domestic product went up, while the total number of people employed went down. Why? And the estimate is that by 2038, 80% of our population will not make enough money to survive. 80%. Our options are limited. Redistribute the wealth, some kind of a guaranteed income, from the state, or in Marxist terms, we've seen a significant resistance to a guaranteed income for all Americans distributed by the state. We continue to see resistance to taxing the wealthy. How this plays out, I don't know. Marx also assumed that a highly industrialized economy was required for communism to succeed. What we have seen, for example, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, in each case, these were not industrial societies. And typically in those countries where communist revolutions have occurred, they have been agrarian. That is to say, they are driven by farming. The result has been murder on an unimaginable scale. Why? Because the only way Marxism can work in the long term is to change from a farming-based economy to an industrial-based economy. And by murdering all the generations of farmers and dominating and controlling the educational system, Lenin and Stalin and Mao and others have managed to build communist states. So as much as Marx understood about history, Marx could not possibly have predicted what Stalin and Lenin and Mao did. Second, another shortcoming in Marx's thought. Marx believed that until the classless society, the will of the people remained alienated. Therefore, the Communist Party was the safeguard for the people. In effect, managing the best interest of the people. The reality of the matter is that has never happened. That in reality, if we look at communist countries, we end up with a two-class system. And the result is just as much oppression, if not more, than in a capitalist society. Because one of the intellectual loopholes in Marxism is that in the end, history will judge what we do now. Which ultimately is arguing that the end justifies the means. And that never, never ends well. Can Marxism succeed? I find it very difficult to imagine that it can. Every instantiation, whether Venezuela or China or Cuba or somewhere else in the world, has resulted in as much oppression as capitalism. And the definition of what constitutes freedom is still open. It's hard for me to imagine that the oppression that is rampant in China justifies what little the middle class has compared to people who are poor. Autocracy is autocracy. Any questions so far? Any comments so far? Am I being clear?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, no questions?
I think that the biggest, well, I don't know if it's the biggest, but one of the primary problems with communism is that whenever you pay everyone the same and give, well, not necessarily pay, but give everyone the same exact thing, no one wants to step up and lead in the sense of making sure that everything goes smoothly. And if everyone's on the same level, there's no one to lead. And then nothing goes in the right direction, which is why there's the party on top, and then there's still the two classes.
Well, that is true. And I guess one of the questions we want to ask ourselves is, if we were not in a life negative culture, would that be different? And I honestly don't know the answer to that. I can tell you that as a reaction to the Third Reich in the 1930s in Europe, there is a significant rise in communism. And in fact, many of the intellectuals support the Communist Party. By the end of the Second World War, by 1940, when they begin to learn about what's happening in Russia, Stalin killed so many millions of people that no one even knows how many millions of people he killed. Mao did the same thing in China. No one knows. The six of them published a book called The God That Failed. One of whom was Arthur Koestler, whose book Darkness at Noon is a historical fiction novel critiquing the logic of Marxism, the logic of communism. All right, let's put this within a logical construct. Let's put it in terms of where we are now and those things that Marx was right about. Alienation is increasing. It is not diminishing. A few weeks ago, we talked about the transition in America from 1950 to 1970. We said that over this period, we went from a golden age where one person could support a family of four to two adults, actually one person to five, where it took two adults to support a family of four. We have seen since 1970 a significant drop in wages. We have seen an increase in displacement. Remember, we talked about displacement in the 1960s, people who went to high school began displacing people at the low end of the job spectrum who were blue collar workers with no high school diploma. By the 1970s, people with college degrees have begun to displace people who are high school graduates. At the rate we're going, our local McDonald's will be staffed by people with master's degrees. So a measure of that alienation is a declining standard of living. Underemployment. The rise of an economy that is built on debt. Marx was right. Debt is a terrible form of oppression. Number 3, declining access to essential services. Primarily healthcare and education. I have now been an adjunct at UNCG for 5 years. The drop in overall literacy over that 5 years has been dramatic. If you go back to my undergraduate years, I was reading on average 300 pages per class per week. And not articles, books. And I was expected to do it, and I had to do it. So the decline in education and the decline of literacy is significantly damaging our culture. The cost of healthcare is reaching unmanageable proportions. 4, our future is increasingly uncertain. As long as we continue to argue our friend Milton Friedman, that capitalism has no social responsibility, we're going to be headed increasingly towards a cliff. And it is increasingly difficult for me to see how we're going to avoid some kind of civil war or potential revolution when the separation between rich and poor is ever increasing, and we seem to be unable to find a middle ground. If the MIT statistics are correct, how can we have a consumer-based economy when people don't have enough money to survive? If you go back to the election, I was paying somewhere between $1.75 and $1.89 for gas. I'm lucky to find it Who does this affect? Not the rich. I'm not telling you that Marx is the answer. I think his critique of political economy is dead on. But capitalism, as embraced by Milton Friedman, Ronald Reagan, trickle-down economics doesn't work. One of the mistakes that we've made is equating socialism and communism. In fact, they're not. So over the next several weeks, as we look at some of the social issues surrounding capitalism and business in general, we want to begin to seriously ask ourselves, can capitalism be ethical and moral? And by the way, I think the answer is yes. But how do we change capitalism, some of its fundamental assumptions, in order to build a more equitable, just society? I think in some shape or form, without some kind of socialism and some concept of profit that is not measured by the sheer accumulation of wealth, it's going to be a very difficult future. Very difficult. I will leave you to think about that. Thank you for coming. Do remember office hours. And I will look forward to seeing you. Don't leave yet. I'm just going to stop the recording, and then I'm going to take attendance.